She ran off with my pension for a getaway, yet one look in the fridge left her screaming aloud. The front door had slammed nearly 3 hours earlier, but the sugary perfume of Yulia's daughter still clung to the hallway like a stubborn ghost. That scent never fit the old brownstone. The building was used to quiet her smells. Dust, dried lavender tucked in linen drawers, the faint ghost of starch from years of ironing. The perfume was loud, glittery, and young, as if it believed age and time were things that happened only to other people. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Yulia stood in the middle of the kitchen, hands resting on the back of a faded wooden chair, staring at the pantry door. The silence of the apartment, usually a soft blanket at the end of a long day at the sewing machine, now felt like an animal crouched in the corners, waiting. Her back ached in its familiar way, a dull line of pain between her shoulder blades from decades of bending over other people's hems. Her fingers still held the phantom memory of the last dress she'd finished. Tiny stitches, invisible mends, perfect seams that no one would notice unless they were wrong. Her stomach twisted. It was a simple, humiliating thing. Hunger, the blunt physical reminder that her body needed something she did not have. She tried to ignore it, but the ache throbbed deeper, turning the quiet into something sharp. She moved toward the pantry. The hinges protested with a creak as she pulled the door open, the sound echoing too loudly in the small kitchen. The shelves inside were tidy. They were also almost bare. A row of mismatched plates, a half-empty box of tea, a jar of pickles floating in cloudy brine, and long stretches of clean empty wood where sacks of flour and sugar used to sit. Her daughter's carefree voice from that morning came back like a slap. "Mom, give me your card. Just in case. What if the ATM at the beach doesn't work or something?" Yulia remembered the chill that slid down her spine when she'd looked at that plastic rectangle in her wallet. It was her entire social security check for the month. It was rent, medication, bus fare, bread. It was all the little things that didn't look like much on their own but held her life together. "That's my whole check, Tessa," she had murmured. Her daughter's full name was Quintessa, but everyone called her Tessa. "What am I supposed to live on for 2 weeks?" "Oh, please don't start." Tessa had rolled her eyes, already standing in the doorway in sandals and a bright sundress, suitcase at her feet. "You've got a full jar of grits. Boil them with water, put a little butter, you'll be fine. It'll be good for you. A detox. Doctors say people your age should eat less anyway. Don't create drama where there is none. I deserve this vacation." She hadn't waited for an answer. The card disappeared from Yulia's fingers with a practiced little swipe. The suitcase rolled down the hall, the door slammed, and Yulia was left with silence, an empty wallet, and the offhand promise of grits. Grits. Yulia reached for the highest shelf of the pantry, where an old glass jar stood, its label written in her own wavering handwriting 20 years earlier. The sticker said, "Grits," in faded blue ink. The jar felt suspiciously light before she even removed the lid. She opened it, angled it toward the window. Light fell onto the bottom, where a thin dusting of grayish crumbs clung to the glass. A few grains rattled like sand when she shook it. Not enough for a bowl. Not enough for a mouthful. She stared at it, the hollow little echo inside the jar somehow louder than anything that had happened all day. Tessa hadn't even checked. She had thrown the words, "full jar of grits," over her shoulder like a used tissue, something to plug up her mother's protest, and then forgotten about her the moment the Uber app told her the driver had arrived. A chill started in Yulia's chest, as if someone had opened a window in midwinter. It wasn't a draft. It was a realization so cold it felt physical. For years she had told herself that her daughter was just busy, stressed, distracted, young. That selfishness was a phase Tessa would grow out of when life taught her a few lessons. Now, staring at the empty jar, Yulia finally saw something else. Not just selfishness, but carelessness sharpened into cruelty. The kind of cruelty that came easily to people who assumed others existed to cushion their fall. Yulia set the jar down. The glass hitting the wooden shelf made a sharp sound, like a small gunshot in a quiet church. She needed money. Not someday. now. Food, not in theory, but in her hands on a plate. She thought of the coins Tessa always scattered, forgotten quarters and crumpled bills that slipped from pockets, rolled under furniture, gathered at the bottom of a purse. Tessa treated money the way she treated everything else. Dramatically, carelessly, sure that something or someone would show up to fix any unpleasant consequences. Yulia went to her daughter's bedroom. The room looked as if a whirlwind had passed through and decided to settle in. Clothes lay draped over chairs, the bed, even the floor. The vanity was a battlefield of lipsticks without caps, mascara wands, compacts smudged with bronzer. Perfume bottles caught the light like tiny crystal grenades. Receipt after receipt had been tossed onto the carpet and stepped on until the ink blurred. Yulia began to search with the practiced patience of someone used to looking for lost buttons and unobtrusive stains. She checked pockets, turned over cushions, peered into mugs where Tessa sometimes dropped loose change. Nothing. No safety net of forgotten coins. No folded tens slipped behind the mirror. She was about to give up when she saw a folded piece of paper on the floor near the trash can, crumpled but not thrown away. It had been close enough to the bin to suggest a half-hearted attempt to get rid of it, then abandoned. Yulia picked it up and smoothed it out. Scrolling letters. Company logos. Flight numbers. A hotel name that sounded like it had been invented by someone who never needed a discount. She scanned line after line until her eyes caught on the total. It sat near the bottom of the page in thick black numbers, slightly larger than the rest of the text, impossible to miss. 2 weeks in a beachfront hotel. An airline ticket. Extras and fees. The sum of it all matched exactly 3 months of her social security checks. 3 months of oatmeal and second-hand medicine pills and electricity bills paid at the last minute. 3 months of saying, "It's fine, I'll buy fruit next week," and then not buying it. 3 months she had pressed and folded and saved so that her daughter could walk barefoot on sand and drink bright cocktails with umbrellas in them. Yulia stayed there for a moment, in the half-dark of Tessa's room, the curtains drawn badly so that shadows climbed the walls. The air felt thick. For a wild second she wondered if she was the one who'd gone mad, that she had been living in some reversed universe where parents beg and starve, and children behave like landlords waiting for their property to be vacated. She left the room slowly, closing the door with a quiet, deliberate click, as if sealing that space, and the girl who owned it, behind glass. In the living room, the old brownstone showed its stored wealth without apology. On one wall stood a heavy oak buffet carved with swirling vines and flowers, the doors polished so many times the edges had dulled. Behind its glass panels, crystal bowls and fine porcelain plates glimmered softly. The set for 12 that had come from Yulia's grandmother and had been used twice. Maybe 3 times. She had always told herself it was waiting for Tessa's wedding reception. The wedding never came. The porcelain simply stood there, year after year, like guests who had arrived too early and grown dusty waiting for a party that kept being postponed. On the sideboard sat a silver tea service, cool and gleaming, its surface reflecting the faint outline of Yulia's tired face whenever she passed. Beside it, a jewelry box held pieces no one had worn in a long time. Necklaces too fancy for the doctor's office, bracelets too fragile for bus rides. In the hallway closet, fur coats wrapped in garment bags hung like slumbering animals. Tessa called them dust museums, with her wrinkled nose, and told her mother to sell them years ago, but Yulia couldn't. Every coat was a story. A Christmas bonus, a long-ago anniversary, a gift from a husband who had been gone so long now that sometimes she wasn't sure she remembered the sound of his laugh. She looked around. The brownstone wasn't just an apartment. It was a vault. A place stuffed with value that, in practice, did not feed or warm or comfort her. It was a museum curated for a future in which Tessa would inherit it all and, Yulia imagined, finally see and appreciate her mother's sacrifices. In reality, Yulia had become the unpaid curator of her daughter's imaginary estate, a woman who shuffled around in worn slippers, dusted the altar of other people's ambitions, and counted coins to buy bread. Her stomach growled again. The sound mingled with something new. It wasn't the hot spike of anger she'd sometimes felt when Tessa tossed barbed comments about old people diets. It was clearer, cooler. Like someone had finally wiped a fogged mirror clean. Yulia went to the coffee table and sorted through a stack of old newspapers. Tessa complained about these too, accusing her mother of hoarding useless junk. Yulia kept them partly out of habit and partly because she loved the feeling of turning paper pages instead of swiping on a screen. Somewhere among the pages was something she remembered circling with a red pencil, and then pretending not to think about again. She found it halfway through an issue of the local chronicle. The rectangle of red pencil barely showed under the lamplight, but she remembered every word of the tiny ad it framed. An antiques buyer, house calls, silver, porcelain, fair prices. A name. A phone number. Her gaze drifted to the old rotary phone on the side table. It had been there longer than Tessa had been alive. 4 years, it had carried voices of family members, clients, telemarketers. Then, more and more often, silence. She picked up the receiver. The hum of the dial tone sounded steady and almost indifferent. Her finger slipped into the metal ring. The wheel turned slowly as she pulled it from number to number. It felt heavy, each digit an effort, as if she were cracking a safe whose combination had always been inside her but never used. On the third ring, a man's voice answered. Roughened slightly by age or cigarettes, but polite. Yes. This is Sterling. Yulia took a breath. The air smelled like old polish and lavender and something new underneath. Possibility. My name is Yulia Ivanova, she said. I'd like to know if you're interested in silver flatware. Good condition. Early 20th century. Mr. Sterling arrived exactly when he said he would. At 9 in the morning sharp, the doorbell sounded in a bright, punctual ring that cut through the apartment's usual drowsy quiet. Yulia had been up since dawn, sitting in her armchair opposite the buffet, hands folded over her knees, watching the light slowly move across the glass doors. She opened the door to a man in a neatly pressed grey overcoat and a wool scarf. His hair mostly silver and his glasses framing alert, assessing eyes. He had the air of someone who had spent a lifetime looking at valuable things and deciding what they were worth. Mrs. Ivanova? He asked, with a slight tilt of his head. I'm Adrian Sterling. You called yesterday. Come in, Yulia said. Please, don't bother with your shoes. The floors have seen worse. He stepped into the living room and paused, his gaze sweeping over the furniture, the paintings, the carpets. She saw a flicker cross his face, surprise, then curiosity. He had expected, she realized, a different kind of home. Perhaps cluttered furniture inherited in pieces, cheap silver plating instead of real silver, sentimental porcelain that broke at a glance. Instead, he had walked into a space that looked, even now, like an understated showroom. Polished wood. Thick carpets. Paintings hung at careful heights. A clock ticked in the corner, tall and dignified, its brass pendulum swaying behind rippled glass. You have a very interesting interior, Mrs. Ivanova, he said cautiously. This is not an interior, Yulia replied, surprised at how dry her own voice sounded. It's storage. Please, over here. She led him to the oak buffet and opened the lower cabinet. Her hands did not tremble as she brought out the long velvet-lined case. The latch clicked when she opened it, a familiar small sound that had once made her feel proud of the family history inside. 12 silver spoons nestled in the worn fabric, heavy and bright. Their handles were etched with intricate vines and tiny leaves, and on each, in a delicate tangle of letters, were the initials of her grandparents, 2 people who had eaten better in the middle of last century than she had in the last 15 years. Tessa loves these, Yulia said without thinking, and then snapped her mouth shut. The name tasted different now. She used to say she'd serve cake with them at her anniversary dinner. Sterling slipped on thin cotton gloves and leaned over the case with a small magnifying glass. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft tap of metal when he lifted each spoon and examined the back of the handle. Gorham pattern, he murmured to himself. Early production. Excellent condition. Almost no scratches. You barely used them. Never, Yulia said. We admired them. That was all. He straightened, took off his glasses, and looked at her with renewed respect. This is a rare, beautiful set. Many buyers would offer you scrap value and melt them down for weight alone. That would be a crime. I can give you this much. He wrote a number on a notepad and slid it toward her. Yulia stared at it. The figure equaled 5 of her monthly checks. 5 months of life made me wait for the next deposit, of counting coins in small piles on the kitchen table, of saying no to things that cost what a rich person would spend on coffee without thinking. Once, the number would have made her dizzy with relief. She would have imagined all the ways she could stretch it, how careful she would be to make it last as long as possible. But now, having seen Tessa's hotel receipt, having stood in the pantry with that empty jar of grits, something had shifted. She looked up and met Sterling's gaze. No. For a moment he thought she hadn't understood. I can explain how I arrived at the amount, if... I understood perfectly, she said. You're paying yourself a collector's margin. You'll sell this set for 3 times that price. I ran a household my whole life. I know what profit looks like. I'd like a fair dealer's price, not charity. She named a figure, calm and clear. 40% more than he had offered. Not absurd. Not greedy. Just the amount she knew sat between scrap value and what a collector might pay if he presented the set in a velvet-lined showcase. Sterling blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. You bargain like someone who's done this before. Fabric markets, Yulia answered. I spent years arguing over every centimeter of silk for other women's dresses. Sometimes, it turns out, life gives you practice for moments you don't see coming. He hesitated for only a heartbeat and then nodded. Very well. We have a deal. 10 minutes later, he left with the velvet case under his arm, and Yulia stood in the middle of her living room holding an envelope filled with crisp bills. The money had a new smell to it, plastic and ink. It made her heart race, not with fear, but with a sharp, bright rush she hadn't felt since she was young. She had just sold what everyone in her family had once called Tessa's spoons, the precious heirloom dowry. The world did not end. The ceiling did not fall. Her grandparents did not rise from their frame on the wall to scold her. Instead, for the first time in years, her shoulders felt just a little lighter. She did not hide the money under a mattress for emergencies. She put it matter-of-factly into her purse, chose her best coat, a beige cashmere that still felt soft at the collar, no matter how old, and went outside. Her feet carried her not toward the budget supermarket with yellow price tags and bruised vegetables, but toward the part of town where she almost never walked. The pavement was smoother there, the windows shinier. She stopped in front of a market with wide glass doors and a name written in gold letters that she'd pronounced silently many times but never dared enter. The doors opened with a soft hiss and a breath of warm air that smelled like roasting coffee, yeast, and expensive spices. Inside, shelves gleamed with jars and bottles that looked more like treasures than groceries. There were no posters shouting about discounts. Each item seemed to say, if you have to ask the price, perhaps you should go somewhere else. Yulia walked through the aisles as if she'd stepped into a movie she'd only watched from the outside before. She didn't look at potatoes. She didn't reach automatically for the cheapest pasta. She stopped in front of the deli counter and simply said, "Half a pound of that cured ham, please. And some of the Virginia ham, the one with the pepper crust on the edge." She moved to the cheese section and put a wedge of aged Parmesan into her basket, then a soft cheese with a vein of something dark and fragrant running through the center. She added a jar of olives stuffed with almonds. Then she saw them. Peaches. Huge, velvety, glowing under the light as if someone had captured pieces of summer and placed them in a heap on a tray. They were out of season, imported, and absurdly expensive. Yulia picked up 2 and set them gently in the basket, feeling their weight like a promise. At the fish counter, she chose thin slices of cold-smoked salmon. They were translucent, orange-pink, and smelled like the sea and salt and a kind of luxury she had only ever seen in magazines. She finished with a fresh baguette, still warm. When she held it, it crackled faintly, the crust crisp against her palm. At home, she did not eat in the kitchen on the old oilcloth-covered table. She went back to the living room and opened the buffet. She took out a tablecloth of snow-white linen edged with lace she'd crocheted years ago, back when she still believed there would be countless holidays and family celebrations around this table. Tessa hated when she even touched it. "You'll ruin it, Mom. It's for guests." "Today," Yulia whispered, as she spread the cloth so it fell in soft waves over the table. "I am the guest." She took out a dinner plate from the porcelain set, the same one she had protected from chips and cracks as if her life depended on it. A silver fork. A knife with a delicate engraved handle. She arranged the ham in little curls, cut the cheese into rough cubes, poured the olives into a crystal bowl, and sliced the baguette, stacking the pieces like bricks of golden crust. The peach she placed beside her plate, whole. She poured herself black tea into a porcelain cup with a thin gold rim. The cup was so delicate that the heat of the tea turned the white china almost translucent. She ate slowly. The ham was salty and rich. The cheese crumbled and melted on her tongue. The bread shattered under her teeth and then gave way to softness. When she bit into the peach, juice ran down her wrist, and she laughed softly, completely alone in her quiet museum of a house. It was not just hunger she was feeding. It felt, in some quiet way, like reclaiming something. The right to use the things she had spent years preserving for other people's imagined futures. When she was done, only crumbs remained on the plate. Yulia's body felt sated and warm in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She picked up the long receipt from the market and walked to the buffet. Where the velvet case of spoons had sat, there was now a paler rectangle of wood, a ghost outline. She laid the receipt in that empty space. The printed list of delicacies, their prices lined up like soldiers, ended with a single word in capital letters: total. She caught her reflection in the glass, an older woman with tired eyes and a stubborn lift to her chin. "Dinner," she said softly. That was the total. Nothing more, nothing less. The week that followed did not feel like any week Yulia had lived through in the last decade. Time shifted. Instead of waking to the alarm she used to set for early supermarket hours, she opened her eyes when the light found the edges of her curtains. She made breakfast that was not measured in spoonfuls but in slices and flavors. Croissants one day. Fresh eggs scrambled in butter the next, eaten with herbs she bought in small, fragrant bundles. The envelope in her purse thinned, but not dangerously. She was careful in her own way, buying luxury in measured steps, savoring everything she brought home. She did something else too. She stopped glancing nervously at the calendar, counting days until deposits or bills. Instead, she counted backwards, from how many years she had already spent denying herself. On the 8th evening, she sat in her armchair by the window with a glass of red wine balanced in her hand. The bottle had come from a small wine boutique where a young sommelier had spoken to her as if she were an ordinary customer and not an intruder, asking what she liked, suggesting a bottle from 2015 with dark fruit notes and a long finish. The wine was deep and velvety, warming her throat as she sipped. The phone rang. Yulia knew who it was before she reached for it. Tessa always called as if the world owed her attention, the ring sounding more like an order than a question. Yulia lifted the receiver and did not set down her glass. "Hello, Mom." Tessa's voice burst across the line, sparkling with sun and noise. In the background, Yulia could hear the crash of waves, the shriek of seagulls, and music pulsing with a beat meant for tanned, careless bodies. "How are you holding up?" Tessa shouted. "Still alive in there?" The fake concern slipped between her words like a thin blade. Yulia took another sip of wine before answering. "I'm fine, Tessa." "I bet you're bored out of your mind," Tessa went on, hardly listening. "And hungry. You boiled those grits, right? Just add more water so they last longer. Grandma always said that, remember? That way you get a full pot, even if there's not much grain. Anyway, don't waste electricity. Try not to turn on every light in the house. I'm going to have to pay that bill when I get back, and after this trip, I am broke." Yulia glanced at the lamp beside her. Its warm light made the wine in her glass glow ruby red. On the coffee table, a plate of small biscuits sat waiting. She passed a finger around the rim of the glass, feeling the smooth cool. "I'm managing," she said calmly. "You don't need to worry." "Oh, come on, don't pretend you're fine." Tessa laughed brightly. "You always try to be brave. Just hold on for one more week. I even got you a fridge magnet shaped like a dolphin. It's so cute. You'll love it. I'll show it to you if you haven't smashed the fridge door by then." The line crackled slightly. Tessa was talking more to fill the spaces between her own thoughts than to hear any answer from her mother. Yulia listened, feeling none of the usual rush to defend herself, to promise she was being careful, to swear she was saving. "I've found resources you didn't know about," Yulia said instead, looking toward the cupboard where the remaining porcelain waited. "Oh, really?" Tessa's laugh sharpened. "What did you find? A few coins under the sofa? Or did you go to the neighbor to beg for salt and sugar again? Mom, please, do not embarrass me with the neighbors. Don't go around asking for charity. I mean it." Before, Yulia would have rushed to say that she would never, that she had some pride left, that she would eat air before she begged. Now she simply smiled into the receiver and said nothing. "Well, I have to run," Tessa finished. "We're going to a pool party. Try not to set the place on fire without me." The line went dead. The empty click reached Yulia's ear and then dissolved into the apartment's warm quiet. She sat still for a moment. Then she looked at the notebook lying next to the phone. On the open page was a time she had written earlier. "Tomorrow, 11 o'clock, Mr. Sterling, wardrobe." She had planned to sell the huge oak wardrobe in the hall. It was an impressive piece, carved and heavy, with a mirror that reflected her full figure and made her feel old and small at once. It jutted into the passage, snagged sleeves as she walked by, and seemed to cast a shadow wider than its would. But suddenly, the thought of men with ropes and dollies wrestling that monster up and down the stairs exhausted her. She wanted something cleaner, sharper, something that would cut as precisely as Tessa's words about watering down porridge. Yulia set down the glass and went to her bedroom. Inside the top drawer of her dresser lay a small velvet box. It was not locked. Nothing in the apartment was locked, really. For years, she had believed that trust was what made a home feel like a home. She opened the box. On a cushion of faded blue velvet, a gold brooch rested, the shape of a twig, its leaves made of tiny diamonds, and at the center a dark oval ruby that caught and swallowed the light. It looked like a drop of blood that had crystallized over time. Tessa loved this brooch. She would reach for it as naturally as she reached for the hairbrush, pinning it to blazers before work events and dresses before parties. "It's vintage, Mom. No one else has anything like it," she'd say, not asking permission, only announcing the fact that she was taking it. Once she had come home late and tossed the brooch on the dresser, the clasp broken and hanging. "It fell off," she shrugged. "Can you fix it? You're good with little things." "I don't have time to take it to a jeweler." So Yulia had sat under the lamplight with a needle, invisible thread, and the patience of a woman used to repairing other people's damage. She picked up the brooch now. The ruby was cold against her palm, then slowly began to warm with the heat of her skin. She turned it over, watched how the facets caught the light. The piece had weight, history, expectations. All of them pointed in the same direction, toward Tessa's hands. But history, Yulia thought, could be rewritten. The next morning, when Mr. Sterling arrived again, punctual as ever, he stepped inside expecting to measure the wardrobe and perhaps argue over its value. Instead, Yulia met him in the living room with the small velvet box in hand. "I've changed my mind about the wardrobe," she said. "For now. But I have something else you might like more." She opened the box and held it toward him. Sterling's gaze sharpened. He removed his gloves with deliberate movements, then put them back on and lifted the brooch as if it were a fragile living thing. He turned it under the light, examining the back, the setting, and the clasp Yulia had repaired years before. "This is a beautiful piece," he said slowly. "Late 19th century work, I'd say. Perhaps Russian, perhaps Creole. The ruby is natural, not treated. Very deep color. Old mine-cut diamonds. It has character and quality. These are the best pieces to find. How much? Yulia asked. He named a sum twice as large as what he had paid for the silver spoons. She did not bargain this time. The price felt right in her bones. More importantly, her need to sever this particular tie outweighed any desire to squeeze a few extra bills from it. The brooch had become a symbol of something bitter and one-sided. Selling it felt like prying a splinter out of her skin. "It's yours," she said. He counted out the money and placed it on the table in a neat stack. When his fingers left it, she put her hand over it, the paper cool under her palm. "You know," he said gently, slipping the brooch into a padded pouch, "pieces like this, they don't appear in families by chance. They tend to have stories. Sometimes painful ones." "They do," Yulia agreed. "But that story is over. Now it will just be gold and stone, and someone else will worry about keeping it polished." When he left, she carried the new money to the kitchen table. She did not feel like a thief or a traitor to her ancestors. She felt like someone rediscovering the language of her own needs. The next call she made was not to a supermarket. It was to a restaurant she had walked past many times but never entered, the kind of place where the menu was posted outside in a frame, and the prices made her look away quickly. "I'd like delivery," she told the hostess who answered. Her voice held steady. "Crab and avocado salad. Veal medallions with mushroom sauce. And a bottle of champagne, please. Good champagne. Cold." She gave her address and when the order total was read out, she did not flinch. She read the numbers off her card, Tessa's card, with the strange amusement of someone placing a bet with coins that had already been stolen from them. The food arrived in white containers warm to the touch, the champagne beaded with condensation. Yulia set the table again, more casually this time. She ate slowly, tasting each bite as if she were filing it away in a new section of her memory entitled, "Things I Did for Myself and No One Else." She thought she had felt the full extent of her anger and her liberation already. It turned out she hadn't even come close. The realization came in the form of cheap glossy paper. She was looking for a certificate for a painting, some document that might increase its value if she decided to sell it, when she opened the bottom drawer of the old secretary desk. Inside were the usual strata of old life, instruction manuals for appliances that had broken years ago, bills that had long since been paid, warranties that had expired, leaflets, pamphlets, and unidentifiable stacks of paper Tessa had swept from counters into drawers, to deal with later. Yulia flipped through them with mounting irritation, sending a hairdryer manual to one side, a leaflet about cholesterol to another. Her fingers brushed something smoother, thicker. A plastic folder, bright red, the kind sold cheaply in office supply stores. She pulled it out. It was not hers. She didn't buy things in such shouting colors. Her files were mostly brown, black, or soft blue. Tessa liked red. Red handbags, red phone cases, red folders. Inside lay several papers clipped together. On the top sat a brochure. Smiling older people sat in a landscaped yard, blankets over their knees and checkers on a table between them. Above them, in neat serif letters, the name of the place arched, Restful Meadows Senior Residence. Yulia stared at the photograph. She had heard that name before, from a neighbor whose cousin had ended up there. She remembered the way the neighbor had spoken, quietly, with a grimace, about bleach and boiled cabbage and the smell of neglect disguised as disinfectant. About staff who were overworked and underpaid and sometimes unkind, and residents who stared at ceilings because they had nothing left to look forward to. Her pulse began to drum in her ears. She pushed the brochure aside and picked up the next sheet. Legal language. Boxes for names and dates. At the top, her name. In the line below, the words, "Attorney in fact, Tessa Ivanova." It was a draft of a power of attorney. In the smallest, most crowded print on the paper, a list of powers: manage property, sell real estate, represent in medical institutions, make decisions. In the margin, in blue ink, someone, most likely Tessa, had scribbled a date. Next month. just after the day Tessa was due to come back from the beach. For a moment, Yulia thought she might faint. The room seemed to tilt, the wallpaper bowed slightly inward. She clutched the edge of the desk to steady herself, breathing slowly. No tears came. They had dried up somewhere between an empty jar of grits and the first peach she had bitten into. This was not a spoiled child thoughtlessly taking too much. This was a plan. A long, methodical plan. Tessa was not simply waiting for her mother to die someday so she could inherit the brownstone and everything in it. She was, Yulia realized with a kind of frozen clarity, tired of waiting. She meant to move things along. Check Yulia into restful meadows like a piece of furniture being sent to storage. Sign papers. Sell the apartment. Liquidate the antiques. Use the money as her own. Tessa had taken the social security card that morning with a smile on her lips and a half-serious joke about detox, knowing that in a few weeks she might sign a document that would allow her to move her mother out of her own home. The fury that rose now was not hot. It was not the kind that made people throw plates or slam doors. It was cold and precise. It sharpened every line in Yulia's image of her daughter until it was cut. She put the brochure and the draft form back into the red folder but did not hide it. She left it half open in the drawer, where it could stare up at her like a wound whenever she needed reminding. Then she reached for the phone. "Mr. Sterling," she said when he answered. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, thin and tight as a piano wire pulled to the limit. "It's Yulia again. Have you gone far?" "Just a few streets away," he replied. "Did something happen? Did you find another piece you want me to look at?" "I found a reason," she said. "Come back. And bring a truck. We are not selling one thing. We are selling everything. Everything." Surprise cracked through his professional calm. "Mrs. Ivanova, forgive me, but that is a major decision. Are you sure you don't want to take some time to?" "I'll have time," she cut in quietly. "Just not in the way my daughter plans. Come back, Mr. Sterling, while I still have the right to sign my own name." The next hours passed in a blur. Sterling arrived with two movers who had the particular strength of men who carried heavy histories for a living. They asked no questions beyond the practical ones. "This piece too. Wrap the glass on this. Disassemble the base." Yulia pointed. The painting in the living room, a quiet river seen through autumn trees, came down from the wall. The clock in the corner was stopped and carried away, its last tick fading into silence as someone disconnected the weights. The Persian rug was rolled up in a cylinder that took both men to lift. Porcelain services, side tables, mirrors with gilded frames, all of it moved, piece by piece, out the door. With each load, Yulia felt something gather in her chest and then leave with the furniture. Shame. Obligation. The weight of phrases like, "for the children," and "for the future." The room grew emptier. It also grew lighter. More air flowed through, as if the apartment itself had been holding its breath for years and was finally exhaling. Sterling wrote checks and counted cash. The sum grew and grew, reaching levels that would have stunned Yulia a week earlier. He paused more than once, looking at her. "Are you sure you won't regret this?" he asked quietly when the last porcelain box was carried out. "You're not required to sell everything. You could keep a few pieces that mean something." "I will regret only one thing," she said, gazing at the pale rectangles on the walls where paintings had hung. "That I did not do this 10 years ago." When the door closed behind the last mover, she stood in an echoing living room. She carried a single large envelope now, stuffed full of cash and checks. It was heavier than the velvet spoon case had been. It felt, in a strange way, like a new kind of dowry, a dowry she was giving to herself. She did not let the shock settle. This time, she knew exactly what to do. First, she called a cleaning service and requested a full cleaning. Windows, walls, floors. Today, if possible. "I'll pay extra," she added, not flinching when she named her price. Then she turned to the fridge. The old Kelvinator hummed loyally in the corner of the kitchen, doors smeared with fingerprints that never completely washed off, humming like a tired tractor. Yulia pulled it open. Inside, the shelves were clean but mostly empty. A half-empty jar of pickles. A heel of cheese, dried out at the edges. A bottle of mustard too old to remember purchasing. By late afternoon, the cleaners had scrubbed away cobwebs and dust that had existed longer than some of the furniture. The windows shone. Light poured into the living room in sheets instead of dusty shafts. The air smelled like lemons and something crisp and new. Then the bell rang again. This time, 2 young couriers stood in the doorway. Behind them, in the dim stairwell, stacks of insulated boxes waited. They brought them in with effort, placing them one after another on the kitchen floor until the room looked like a warehouse for delicacies. Yulia opened the fridge wide. "Everything goes in," she said. The couriers blinked but obeyed. One of them whistled under his breath when he saw the labels. Tins of black caviar. Rows of them, blue and gold lids flashing under the kitchen light. Truffles in small glass jars. Foie gras. Butter in blocks wrapped in thick golden foil. Wheels of cheese. Air-dried meats. Boxes of Belgian chocolates. Packages of smoked salmon. Exotic fruits whose names she had read but never spoken aloud. Mangosteen, dragon fruit, star apple. On the door shelves, there was no place now for cheap ketchup or plastic jars of margarine. Instead, a bottle of champagne slid into place. Then another. And another. She had ordered expensive brands, some of them with vintage years printed proudly on their labels. The couriers worked in silence, only occasionally exchanging glances as the fridge filled to bursting. Yulia directed them with the efficiency of someone arranging pieces in a puzzle. Truffles on the top shelf next to the caviar, fruits in the vegetable drawer, cheeses in the middle, cured meats beneath them. By the time the last box was empty, the refrigerator looked nothing like the one she had opened the week before. Instead of a flickering bulb illuminating lonely shadows, light now bounced off glass and metal and waxed rinds. The air that escaped when she closed the door carried a chill laden with salt, cream, and the faint sharpness of champagne. When the apartment quieted again, Yulia opened the door one last time and stood there, letting the cold kiss her face. The shelves bowed faintly under the weight. The blue and gold tin lids shimmered. The fruits glowed with tropical color in their drawer. This, she thought, watching the abundance condensed into that white box in the corner, is what my daughter believes she is entitled to. This, she plans to inherit without ever having to look at what it cost me. She closed the door with a gentle push. The latch clicked shut, the sound light yet final. 2 weeks later, at noon, a key scraped in the front door lock. Yulia sat at the kitchen table, facing the window, a cup of tea in her hand. Not a chipped mug of weak brew this time, but a porcelain cup of good Darjeeling, dark and fragrant. She heard the door swing open hard enough to hit the stopper on the wall. "Mom, I'm home." Tessa's voice rang down the hallway, full of triumphant exhaustion. Suitcase wheels thundered across the parquet. "I hope you're ready to apologize. I don't want to listen to whining today. I'm dead from the flight." Yulia didn't move. She lifted her cup. The tea warmed her fingers. A faint perfume, her new sandalwood and jasmine, hung in the air, mixing with the crisp scent of detergent from freshly washed floors. Tessa came closer. She stopped just inside the living room. There was no rug under her feet, only bare, polished boards that made her steps sound louder. The corner where the clock had stood loomed strangely empty. The walls, stripped of paintings, showed pale rectangles where frames had hung. "What on earth?" Tessa's voice thinned. "Why is it so empty? Where is everything?" She sounded more offended than alarmed. "Mom." She shook her head, as if clearing water from her ears. "Fine, we'll talk about your redecorating crisis later. I'm starving." The plain food was disgusting. "Please tell me you at least cooked something simple. I could murder a sandwich. Even stale bread and butter." She tossed her purse on the floor and headed for the kitchen without even looking at Yulia. Habit guided her straight to the humming white rectangle in the corner. Yulia set her cup down with a soft clink. "Go ahead," she said quietly. Open it. Tessa grabbed the handle with the brisk, impatient movement of someone who has yanked open the same door 1,000 times, expecting the same sad collection of groceries. She pulled. The door swung wide. The light inside flared. For a second there was silence. Then Tessa screamed. It was not a scream of pain or even anger. It was a sound dragged out of her by sheer disbelief. She stumbled backward, one hand flying to her mouth, the other gripping the edge of the open door as if she needed physical support to stabilize what she was seeing. The refrigerator was full. Not just full. Stuffed. At eye level, 3 neat towers of caviar tins gleamed. The labels, a deep blue ringed with gold, seemed to glow in the fridge light. Below them lay bottles of champagne on their sides, nestled together. Each label spoke of vineyards and years and celebrations that had never happened in this apartment. Truffles, tucked into small glass jars, lay between wedges of cheese that smelled of caves and mountains instead of supermarket plastic. Exotic fruits crowded the vegetable drawer. Bright pink dragon fruit. Shiny yellow mangoes. Purple spheres with green caps. On the door shelves, instead of discount spread and generic condiments, stood jars of foie gras and stacked boxes of fine chocolates. The cold inside smelled not of leftovers and antiseptic but of salt, cream, and distant coasts. "What is this?" Tessa managed, her voice breaking. "What did you do?" She reached out and touched one tin of caviar, pressing it gently as if expecting the label to peel away and reveal something fake beneath. The metal was cold, solid, unforgiving. She turned to her mother. The tan she had so proudly cultivated at the beach had lost its golden glow in the apartment's clear light. Against the softly colored walls and polished floor, it looked harsh, almost dirty. "Where did this come from?" she demanded. "Mom, where did you get money for this? You don't have this kind of money. Did you take out a loan? Are you insane? There will be interest. We'll lose the apartment." "I was hungry," Yulia said, folding her hands on the table. "You took my check. You left me with an empty pantry and an empty jar where the grits used to be. I had to improvise." Tessa's eyes darted back to the fridge, then to the living room, noticing for the first time all the missing pieces. The bare walls. The absence of the buffet. The empty patch of floor where the rug had been. Her gaze snapped back to her mother, then dropped to the envelope on the counter, partly open, revealing bank slips and receipts. The realization swept across her face in waves. Horror. Confusion. And finally, fury. "You sold it," she whispered. "You sold everything. The porcelain. The silver. The clock. That painting. You ate my inheritance." Yulia tilted her head just slightly. "No. I used my property to feed myself. I turned objects into food and time. That's what money is for. You are confusing inheritance with possessions, Tessa. One exists in the future. The other is what I own now, while I am alive." "That was my money," Tessa burst out, her voice rising. "You promised all that to me. You said it was for my wedding, for my future. You had no right to just blow it on groceries." "This house, these things, were never a promise," Yulia said. "They were a habit. I stopped that habit." Tessa lunged away from the fridge, grabbed a jar of caviar and a bottle of champagne, clutching them to her chest as if they might suddenly disappear. "I'm taking these back," she said, shaking slightly. "You'll return them. We'll get something back. I'm not letting you devour what's left of this place." She turned toward the door, the tins rattling faintly against the glass bottle. "Put them back," Yulia said. Her voice did not rise, but the calm in it was so absolute that it felt like a wall being built in midair. "No," Tessa snapped. "This is my money, and you've clearly lost touch with reality. You need to see a doctor. You're selling off everything we own to eat like a queen for 5 minutes. That's not normal. I'm calling for help. They'll declare these sales invalid. They'll see you're not in your right mind." Her phone was in her hand before she'd finished the sentence. Her fingers flew over the screen, and within seconds she was breathlessly explaining to an emergency dispatcher that her elderly mother had suffered a breakdown, that she was selling all her property in some kind of episode, that she was unsafe and needed to be stabilized. Yulia listened. The words did not move her. If anything, the unfairness of them hardened into something even more solid inside her. When Tessa hung up, she was breathing fast, triumph and panic wrestling on her face. "They're sending someone," she said. "Finally someone who knows what's best for you." The doorbell rang much sooner than Yulia expected, but on the other side stood not paramedics. It was their upstairs neighbor, Theodosia, in her forever floral house dress, hair pinned up in a messy bun that failed to hide how much she listened at the stairwell when something interesting happened. Beside her, in his grey coat and with his ever-present briefcase, stood Mr. Sterling. "Tessa," said Theodosia, blinking as she took in the sight of the younger woman standing red-faced in the hall. "What's with all the shouting? I heard you from my kitchen." And this gentleman was ringing the bell as well, looking confused. "So I thought." "Good afternoon," Sterling added mildly. "I'm here to pick up a box of books your mother and I agreed on. Is everything all right?" Tessa seized the moment like a drowning person grabbing a branch. "You're perfect," she said, almost dragging Theodosia up the hall. "You're a witness. You've seen how weird she's been. Mom has completely lost her mind. She sold all the furniture, all the antiques, everything down to the last spoon, and filled the fridge with caviar. This," she waved the bottle and jar for emphasis, "is dementia. She has no concept of money anymore. You have to tell the doctors that when they come, they can stop these deals. They can declare her incompetent." They entered the kitchen together. Yulia sat at the table in her emerald robe, her hair brushed back, a touch of color on her lips. She looked more rested than Theodosia had ever seen her. On the table lay a plate with bread and butter, a small open tin of caviar, and a cup of tea. The scene looked less like a breakdown and more like a quiet celebration. "Yulia," Theodosia asked carefully, "are you feeling all right?" "I am," Yulia said. "Better than in many years. Would you like some tea, Theodosia? We have enough for everyone." She gestured toward the open fridge door. The neighbor's eyes widened. "My goodness," she whispered. "Is that real?" "She's completely gone," Tessa insisted. "She spent a fortune on food. That's a sign, isn't it? People with mental problems lose control over money. That's what the articles say. And this man," she turned on Sterling, "took advantage of her. You tricked her into selling things worth millions for pennies. I will sue you. You'll give it all back. She is not of sound mind. The law will be on my side." Sterling did not seem particularly moved. He set his briefcase neatly on a chair, opened it, and removed a folder with several papers. He put on his glasses before speaking. "Miss Ivanova," he said calmly, "I would not have made a single purchase here without protecting myself. I have been doing this work for 40 years. Dishonest buyers end up in court. Honest ones end up buried in paperwork. Here you will find the bills of sale for every item, signed by your mother, and notarized statements confirming that she understood exactly what she was doing, without pressure or confusion." He passed the folder to Tessa, who grabbed it and flipped through it frantically. Legal language. Signatures. Stamps. The whirl of her mother's familiar handwriting everywhere, steady and deliberate. "She's eating the money," Tessa spat. "That can't be normal. Anyone can see that." "And what is normal?" Theodosia asked suddenly, surprising herself. She had sunk into a chair and was now, somewhat shyly, accepting a piece of buttered bread with caviar Yulia passed her way. "To save pretty plates for some future guest who never comes? To turn your house into a museum and your kitchen into a waiting room? To tighten your belt while your daughter runs around beaches with your money?" She took a careful bite, her eyes closing briefly in pleasure. "This is very good," she added, almost despite herself. "Thank you," Yulia said politely. "She was saving all this for me," Tessa insisted, ignoring them. She always said the house and everything in it would be mine someday. My future. My security. She planned it that way. I planned nothing, Yulia corrected. I only repeated what my parents said. And what their parents said. Everything for the children. At some point it stopped being a tradition and became a sentence. As if living my own life, with my own joy, was a crime. I have decided to pardon myself. Silence fell for a moment. The fridge hummed. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. A dog barked on the street. You'll regret this, Tessa whispered. You will. One day you'll be sick and weak and alone. And who will bring you a glass of water then? These people. Your caviar? I won't. I can promise you that. Ah, that reminds me, Yulia said, reaching calmly into the drawer of the table. Her fingers brushed the smooth surface of the red folder. She pulled it out and placed it where everyone could see. Tessa recognized it immediately. The color drained from her face. What is that? Theodosia asked. The future my daughter had planned for me, Yulia answered. She opened the folder and slid the brochure for Restful Meadows across the table. The smiling faces of the old people on the front shone under the kitchen light. And behind it, a power of attorney she was preparing. To sell the brownstone. To sign medical papers. To move me into a state facility with the charm of a forgotten basement. Tessa shook her head frantically. It's not what you think. It's just in case. You're always so dramatic. It's a decent place, Mom. You would have. Don't lie, Yulia said quietly. The softness in her voice was gone. Only steel remained. You didn't choose a decent place. You chose the cheapest. The one no one wants to visit. You chose the fastest way to free my bed and have the apartment keys for yourself. You were not doing me a favor. You were arranging a disposal. Theodosia stared at Tessa, genuinely shocked. Sterling closed his briefcase with a firm click, his mouth a thin line. He had seen greed, but this level of calculation seemed to disgust even him. Yulia picked up the brochure and placed it in Tessa's hands. Keep it, she said. You may find it useful someday. For yourself. Because you will not grow old in this apartment. You can't throw me out, Tessa breathed. I live here. I'm registered here. You can't, Mom. I'll call the police. I'll take you to court. You can call whoever you like, Yulia said. The locks were changed this morning. Your key doesn't work anymore. She nodded toward the suitcase in the hall. Your things are there. You never even unpacked. Now you don't have to. The threat that had always hung unspoken in the air between them, I'll make your life miserable if you don't do as I say, suddenly looked small in Tessa's hands. If you try to break in, Yulia continued, Mr. Sterling and Theodosia here heard you yell that I'm crazy and that you want to overturn my decisions. They heard about the papers. They can testify that I had reason to be afraid. So if you try to force yourself back in, I will call the police. Not to defend the furniture. To defend myself. I'll ruin you, Tessa hissed, eyes shining with tears she hated. I'll tell everyone you're ungrateful, that you're a monster, that you abandoned your own child. You are no longer a child, Yulia said. And I am no longer your museum curator. Tessa stood there for another moment, chest heaving, clutching the red folder as if she could crush the future it represented. Then she grabbed her suitcase, threw a final choking curse into the air, and stomped out. The door slammed behind her, rattling the glass in the hallway pictures. Silence followed, thick and strange. Sterling cleared his throat. I'll go now, he said. We can discuss the remaining books another day, Mrs. Ivanova. For now, I think you deserve some peace. Thank you, Yulia replied. For the fair prices. And for the paperwork. You drove a hard bargain, he said with a faint smile. You're no one's victim, Mrs. Ivanova. Good afternoon. When he left, Theodosia remained for a moment longer, hands wrapped around her teacup. You did the right thing, she said finally. I don't know if I would have dared. But you did. And that sandwich was the most expensive thing I've eaten in my life. And the most satisfying. Yulia laughed softly. The sound felt like someone opening a window after a storm. Then it was worth it, she said. After the neighbor had gone, she walked to the door and slid the bolt into place. The lock clicked once, then again. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood and let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. She had sold her furniture, her porcelain, her daughter's expectations. She had thrown away the script she had been handed at birth. She felt not empty, but strangely full, as if her life, for the first time, belonged to her alone. Weeks passed. Autumn thickened outside, leaves turning from green to copper and collecting in drifts along the sidewalks. Inside, the apartment grew used to its new shape. No heavy wardrobe to darken the hallway. No rug to trap dust. The living room became a wide space with a comfortable armchair, a lamp, a small bookshelf, and a plant that finally began to grow. Yulia stepped out onto the balcony one afternoon with a tray in her hands. On it sat a cup of coffee and a sandwich made from fresh baguette, cream cheese, and slices of smoked salmon. Over her shoulders lay a new shawl, soft and warm. She had bought it with money earned from selling a fur coat moths had already half eaten while she had starved to preserve it. She breathed in cool air that smelled faintly of wet leaves and city smoke. For the first time in a long time, she did not glance back nervously to see if Tessa's door was open or if she was being watched and silently judged. The apartment behind her was quiet. It remained quiet, even on the days when Tessa called from some borrowed room to threaten court or beg for another chance. The last time Tessa had stood outside, pounding on the door and shouting threats about lawyers, Yulia had spoken through the wood. One more call, she had said, and I'll sell this apartment. I'll move somewhere small by the sea and spend every last coin on myself or give it to a shelter for stray cats. Then there will truly be nothing left for you. Think carefully about whether you want to test me. After that, the pounding stopped. Tessa's voice disappeared into the city. Perhaps she would learn to pay her own rent. Perhaps she would find someone else to subsidize her. That part of the story was no longer Yulia's concern. She took a bite of her sandwich now, the bread crackling under her teeth, the fish salty and rich. She chewed slowly, savoring the taste. It reminded her, surprisingly, of the diamond earrings her late husband had once given her. She had worn them twice, their weight pulling on her ears, always afraid one would fall out and get lost. She had kept them locked in a box most of her life, visitable only by memory. When she sold them, somewhere in the whirlwind of the last few weeks, the money they bought groceries, a few small luxuries, and the shawl on her shoulders. The earrings, transformed, now tasted like warmth and spice and life. She sipped her coffee. It was strong and a little bitter, like the grief she had never allowed herself to feel openly when her husband died, when her body grew old, when Tessa's words cut sharper than knives. Bitterness, she realized, could be softened with sweetness and milk, or it could be drunk black, to remind you that you were still capable of tasting something sharply, completely. She looked back into her living room through the balcony glass. The space no longer resembled a museum. It looked like something simpler and rarer, a home for one person who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. She thought about inheritance. About how she had always pictured the end of her life as a kind of careful handoff. A house scrubbed and stocked, a chest of drawers full of linens, a stack of documents in perfect order, a daughter standing in the doorway with keys in her hand, haloed by gratitude. Instead, her life had split open in a different direction. The things she'd saved had become food, wine, warmth, shawls, nights of deep sleep in clean sheets with no fear of being uprooted. The future she had been hoarding for Tessa had turned into a present she was finally living. It turned out that inheritance was not just objects or property. It was also the example one generation left for the next. For years, Yulia had been on track to leave Tessa a lesson that said, "Your life matters more than mine. Take. I will go without." Now, she thought, whether Tessa understood it or not, she had left a different message behind. You owe your parents love, perhaps. or respect, or at least honesty. You do not own them. You do not own their time, their bodies, or the dust on their antique plates. She took another deliberate bite. The sandwich tasted even better this time, as if the flavors had settled. On the side table beside her, a brochure lay folded open, not for a nursing home, but for a small mountain resort with hot springs and walking paths through evergreen forests. There was a package for a month's stay. She had enough money for it now. More than enough. She smiled. The idea of packing a suitcase for herself, of leaving the apartment not in someone else's care but because she decided to wander for a while, made her feel almost giddy. She would go, she decided. Soak in hot water. Breathe clear air. Maybe learn to knit something that was not meant for anyone but herself. For now though, she sat on her balcony above the street, the city murmuring below, the autumn sky widening overhead. Her heart beat steadily. Her stomach was full. Her cupboards were emptier than they had ever been, and her life richer. She raised her coffee cup slightly toward the inside of the apartment, toward the closed front door that no longer admitted anyone who meant her harm. To every woman, she murmured, who finally remembered that she was not born to decorate someone else's future. She drank, and as the hot, slightly bitter coffee spread warmth through her chest, she felt it again. The same taste the first peach had given her, the taste that lingered after champagne and caviar and bread. The particular, unmistakable taste of freedom.